Oh no, my dear friends. This survival expert is just too good this time, surviving in the swamp. Not only did he catch 2 big fat blue crabs, but he also caught a giant mud crab as big as an arm, eating soft quail eggs and chewing on juicy baobab roots. The small life is truly wonderful, like being in paradise. To improve his wilderness survival skills, this time Eddie went to the mangrove swamp region in Madagascar. There are no penguins here, only rotting, unpleasant swamps and vast deserts. Riding Woody's ancient rusty bike, he took his trusty dipping sauce to the beach, then switched to a luxurious homemade motorboat made by the locals. Venturing deep into the mangrove swamp, watching his buddy Eddie drive off quickly without looking back, Eddie felt a whirlwind of emotions inside. The mission this time was to reach a village 40 kilometers away. As always, no food, no survival tools, not even bringing hair, only a bunch of filming equipment that can't be eaten. First, Eddie did a basic survey of the surroundings, then packed up and headed into the swamp. However, the ground here was extremely muddy. Every step felt like swimming in a pit of manure. It not only took a lot of energy, but also slowed down movement. Luckily, Eddie had plenty of experience. He crawled using both hands and feet and managed to escape, but before he could catch his breath, he was blocked by a river several dozen meters wide. Eddie got so mad his imaginary hair nearly stood up. It wasn't fear of swimming. Locals had warned him that short-snouted crocodiles in the water only target bald strangers. They are considered deadly machines. Taking the risk to enter the water was not a wise move. He sat and thought for 2.5 minutes. In the end, he decided to go around. He walked forward for a bit and picked a shallow spot. Eddie ran and walked to the other side. The scary thing was that the surface temperature had now risen above 40 degrees. Without hair for protection, Eddie's bald head sizzled under the sun. At this point, he was showing signs of dehydration. Even worse, the seawater around was rising at a visibly fast rate. With dozens of kilos on his back, escaping was impossible. This made Eddie very scared. Luckily, after waiting for a while, he found a relatively high sandbar. The ground here was dry and looked like it had never been flooded, so Eddie immediately decided to set up camp here. By evening, the seawater surrounded the small island, but the spot where Eddie was remained high and dry. You have to admit, a genius really has foresight. Time passed, and on the second morning, Eddie packed up and continued on. Today's mission was to get out of the swamp and find fresh water, but surprisingly, today's heat was even worse than yesterday. Eddie walked under the blazing sun for 2.5 hours and finally reached solid, dry land. Maybe the reflection from his bald head startled the silly bird nearby. Getting closer, he was lucky to discover a bird's nest. Eddie cracked one open and the pinkish soft egg looked very tempting. Eggs are not only rich in protein but also contain a bit of water. Without hesitation, Eddie popped it into his mouth. The soft texture melted instantly. The taste was beyond imagination. After refueling, Eddie continued on his way. Before long, he reached a baobab forest. Locally, the baobab is known as the tree of life. Its trunk is hollow and its roots go deep into the ground, not only rich in water, but its fruit is also a food source for the locals to survive. After walking for so long, Eddie was both tired and thirsty. He casually found a shady spot to rest for a while. Without water for a long time, Eddie's thinking became sluggish. Seeing vines nearby, with his many years of experience, Eddie guessed that there must be roots underground. So he grabbed a stick and started digging. After an hour, meaning 2.5 hours, he finally saw the pale root inside. This made Eddie overjoyed. Then he started devouring it. One bite was crispy like yam. Inside, it was filled with water, making Eddie smile from ear to ear. Not to mention the protein content is dozens of times higher than beef. To keep the roots from being unable to grow out like his own hair, Eddie carefully covered the hole with soil. Tonight, just temporarily stay here for the night. On the third day, while Eddie was busy traveling, he noticed some fallen baobab fruits. Baobab fruits are rich in vitamins and trace elements. Eddie picked an intact one and opened it to reveal the flesh inside. Eating it felt a bit like chewing cardboard, but luckily it provided him with plenty of energy. Eddie wrapped up 2 fruits to take with him. Although the food issue had been resolved, Eddie still hadn't found a reliable water source. After walking for a while, he reached a dried up riverbed. The soil under his feet was very moist. Digging down might lead to fresh water. No complaints, no complaints. Eddie pulled out his iron hand and started digging. Sure enough, not long after, water started spurting from the soil. No need to filter or boil. Eddie drank freely. It tasted sweet and smooth, delicious beyond imagination. To carry this precious fresh water, Eddie carved a hole at the top of a baobab fruit, then used a shell to scoop and pour it in bit by bit. He had to fill 2 large containers. Only then was Eddie satisfied enough to continue on. Unexpectedly, he had a surprising discovery on the way. A giant wild mud crab curled up under a tree. This kind of mud crab as big as an arm was the first time Eddie had ever seen. Although it looked a bit scary, in reality, it was not cute at all. But thinking about the pale white protein on the crab's body, Eddie still mustered up the courage and struck it a few times. Soon, the crab had passed away and went to meet its ancestors. Then he quickly wrapped it in a bag and and rushed to find a place to cook. Under a massive baobab tree, Eddie once again used his old fire-making skills. The climate here was dry and hot. Without much effort, Eddie successfully started a big fire. Then he threw the whole crab into the hot coals. Finally, he covered it with sand and dirt. By the time night fell, the delicious, nutritious roasted crab was ready. Eddie couldn't wait, tore off a piece, and stuffed it into his mouth. Each bite was juicy, tender, and sweet. The protein content was dozens of times higher than beef. Eddie lay flat on the ground, eating non-stop. After enjoying a hearty, delicious meal, Eddie was finally able to sleep soundly. Time passed to the 5th day, and Eddie had completed more than half the journey. If nothing unexpected happened, he only needed to follow the riverbed to reach his destination. But the bad news was that the fresh water Eddie carried was almost gone. Before finding a new water source, Eddie had to ration the little water he had left. So Eddie kept an eye out for water while walking. From morning until afternoon, Eddie couldn't find a single drop of water. Just when he had lost all hope, a small water hole finally appeared ahead. Eddie cautiously tasted it, and after confirming it was fresh water, he drank freely. Having found fresh water after much difficulty, Eddie of course made good use of it. First, he found a low, damp patch of ground nearby to set up camp, then headed to the mangrove swamp near the water source. The large and small holes on the ground clearly showed something was inside, so Eddie took a stick and kept poking around. Unexpectedly, he actually caught a large blue crab, not small in size either. This made Eddie extremely excited. However, just as he was about to catch the second one, the crab gave him a lesson. Carelessly, he got pinched once, but luckily he still managed to catch 2 large blue crabs. Back at camp, no scallions, ginger, or garlic. He grilled them directly over charcoal. 10 minutes later, the crab aroma filled the camp. Eddie sat by the fire, enjoying the feast. Another bite of rich, fatty crab meat went into his mouth. The fresh, firm texture made Eddie feel full of joy. Not to mention the protein content was thousands of times higher than beef. By day 6, Eddie began speeding up for the final stretch. Using his instincts, he guessed the village wasn't far away. To confirm the direction forward, Eddie planned to climb the sand dune ahead to get a better view. But unexpectedly, the sand here was as slippery as butter. Every step he took forward, he slid 3 steps back. Even worse, the sand reflected heat back onto his body, making him stop to rest every so often. But this didn't trouble the brilliantly smart Eddie. To climb the slope, he used a winding path strategy to spiral his way up to the top. Before long, he reached the summit, but to his surprise, beyond the hill was just another hill. Looking for a long time without seeing the end, Eddie started to wonder if he had gone the wrong way. Even worse, his fresh water was completely gone. Exhausted, Eddie built a fire and decided to rest for the night before continuing. The next morning, full of energy, Eddie resumed his long journey. He walked like that until the afternoon, and finally spotted cattle hoof prints on the ground. Climbing over the last sand dune ahead, a seaside fishing village finally appeared in sight. With that, this challenge came to a perfect end. It's done, my dear friends. The expert who starved for 3 days and 9 meals finally got lucky this time. In Mongolia's polar region, he found a wild mountain goat weighing 99 kilos. Not only did he have a whole stash of smoked dried goat meat, he even caught a fatty ground squirrel. Finally, he added a bit of wild onion to make a snack for after the meal. What a chill, pleasant trip. This time, Eddie went to the Altai Mountains in Mongolia, where the temperature is freezing cold. Temperatures here stay below 0 all year. Even camels, those survival machines, struggle to survive here. The film crew tailed Eddie on a 99 dong tricycle, free shipping included, and soybean oil mixed with peanuts. They had reached the challenge site. As usual, no food, no survival gear. Eddie even made sure not to bring a single strand of hair. This time, the goal was to reach a settlement 100-kilometer away. To avoid freezing into a popsicle, Eddie wore a down jacket for the first time. But even that couldn't stop the bone-chilling wind blowing at 80 km/h. After surveying the area, Eddie noticed a forest on the opposite side of the lake. His experience told him there might be more resources over there, so without hesitation, he planned to cross the lake. At first, the surface of the lake was solid enough to support Eddie's weight, but before he could be happy for even 2.5 minutes, the ice beneath his feet suddenly cracked, making Eddie go pale with fear. He stood completely still, afraid to move. After calming down, he turned around and ran back to shore. Fun is fun, but don't joke around with your life. So Eddie decided to take a detour around the side. They say great disaster brings great fortune. Just a bit further ahead, Eddie discovered a cave house at the foot of a mountain that looked abandoned. He went over to see if he could gather some supplies. He knocked cautiously. After confirming no one was inside, Eddie began scavenging. Luckily, he found a family heirloom iron kettle and a small wool blanket no one wanted. After gathering the materials, he continued on his way. After walking for over 6 hours, the sky had grown dim. Eddie realized he didn't even have a place to sleep, so he hurried to find shelter. These tall little pine trees looked like a decent choice. He quickly decided to camp again. First, he took off his soaking wet clothes, then gathered some dry moss nearby to make a mattress. And so he braved the night. On the morning of day 2, Eddie hurried off again. When thirsty, he sipped some melted ice. He saw holes and guessed they were squirrel burrows. His passive skill hadn't kicked in yet. But he wasn't about to waste the opportunity. He blocked one hole with a rock, then poured water into another using a bottle. Soon, a panicked ground squirrel ran out. Eddie quickly grabbed it. It weighed about 5.5 pounds. That really lifted his mood. With extra food secured, he walked 10 more kilometers to a fork. There, he chose to take a break. He was starving after such a long trek. To save time, he skipped wood drilling. He used a camera battery and steel wire. It shorted and lit the tinder. Good thing he knew his science well. He cleaned and chopped the squirrel, then stewed it in an iron pot. While waiting, he began building shelter. Done. By the time he wrapped it all up, the stewed squirrel was ready. Eddie dug in without hesitation. One bite, the meat was tender and melted in his mouth. So delicious, it exploded with flavor. Eddie devoured one piece after another without stopping. Not to mention the protein content was dozens of times higher than beef. Full and hydrated, he slept soundly until 8 the next morning. He woke up and set off without even washing his face. Unexpectedly, he hadn't gone far when a massive mountain blocked the way. Looking at the towering peak, Eddie obediently took the long way around. And so, after 3.5 hours of hiking, the frozen lake appeared again, completely shocking Eddie. Luckily, he had experience from before. Eddie was sure the ice could support his weight, then confidently stepped onto it, quickly reaching the other side. This shortcut saved him more than half the distance. Then he climbed the mountain to figure out which way to go. To reach the target point, he had to cross the mountain ahead. However, due to the heavy buildup of rocks and snow, Eddie almost slipped and had a fall right then and there. It seemed this path wasn't realistic. After thinking it over for half an hour, Eddie decided to go back the way he came. Choosing a safer route was definitely better. As the saying goes, a blessing may lie in misfortune. On the way, he noticed a few eagles circling overhead. Based on his 2.5 years of wilderness experience, Eddie guessed there was definitely a dead animal nearby. Sure enough, after searching the area, he really did find a wild mountain goat that had passed away. By this point, the goat carcass had been mostly eaten by birds. To determine if it was still edible, Eddie dissected it for a while. After careful inspection, smelling, prodding, and checking, it fully met his food standards. Then he brought the goat back to the previous night's camp. Only with a full stomach can you have the energy to travel. Eddie used a piece of rock he found to skin the goat, then grilled some goat meatballs on a stone slab. As for the lean meat mixed with fat, he smoked it directly over the fire, to use as food for the coming days. By the next morning, snow began to fall lightly. Everything turned white and it was hard to see direction. For safety, Eddie decided to wait until the snow stopped before moving on. Then he turned around and dug up the battle leg of goat he had buried earlier. Looking at the steaming goat leg made his mouth water instantly. He took a big bite and felt overwhelmed with happiness. Not to mention the protein content was thousands of times higher than beef. Full and hydrated again, Eddie went nearby to dig up some wild onions and munched on them, refreshing and appetizing. This meal with both meat and vegetables made Eddie grin from ear to ear. By the 5th day, the sky was clear. Eddie packed his belongings, brought the dried goat meat, and hit the road. He walked while chewing dried goat meat to keep up his energy and soon reached the rocky area. The terrain here was even more treacherous. Eddie nearly slipped and busted his knee. After struggling to get out of the rocky area, he was met with thick snow ahead. The intense sunlight melted all the snow. Walking on it, every step sank deep, costing a lot of effort. Helplessly, Eddie had to crawl on his belly. But this wasn't even the worst part. The midday sun reflecting off the snow could easily cause snow blindness. Eddie knew it was time to stop. He found a shady spot. Spent over 3 hours digging a snow cave. Used goat skin for warmth. It was cozy inside. He was so happy he laughed. Gay. Next day, before snow melted, Eddie kept moving. It was fine until sun melted the valley snow. Walking now took 10 times more effort. To save strength, Eddie crawled with his gear. At that rate, reaching the goal could take years. He couldn't go on. After much thought, he called for help. When the truck came, the challenge ended. He didn't finish. But seeing his family safe was what mattered. This was his closest brush with death. He even came across a live landmine. They nearly all blew up together. Still, the food wasn't too bad. Crispy grilled centipede, soft inside, sweet wild figs, and fresh mushrooms. Life here had its moments. This time, Eddie went to Laos Phu Luang Range, a land scarred by years of war. Deep in the forest, landmines still lay hidden. Eddie flew in with the crew on a cheap helicopter. They reached the site fast. As the chopper noise faded, the challenge began. As the sound of the helicopter faded away, the challenge officially began. No food, no survival tools, not even any hair. Eddie had to reach the pickup point 30 kilometers away within the next 10 days. No fake map, no compass. Eddie relied on the sun to determine direction, then packed up and headed toward the goal. But he didn't expect that just 2 steps forward. Fate dealt him a harsh blow. His path was blocked by a massive mountain. This nearly 90-degree cliff face was harder to climb than the sky itself. With Eddie's personality, of course, if he could take a detour, he would. He turned around and entered a small forest nearby. But this road wasn't easy either. Not only was the vegetation dense, but it was also full of thorns. Every step, Eddie had to be extremely cautious. After walking about 2.5 minutes, Eddie suddenly realized he might be going the wrong way. Helpless, he could only go back and head west. However, compared to the difficult terrain, what troubled him most was the issue of thirst. worst, hiking in the jungle under temperatures over 30 degrees. Without water, he could easily pass out from heat. Just when Eddie was at his wit's end, a sudden glint of light appeared ahead. Getting closer, it turned out to be a small river dug by the film crew. Drinking directly from the river could very likely cause diarrhea, but by now Eddie was nearly dying of thirst. He didn't care anymore. He lay down and gulped it down until his stomach was full. After solving the urgent thirst problem, Eddie began planning the next part of his route. He guessed the river flowed northwest. If he could build a raft and follow the current, it would save him a lot of energy and time. But considering it was getting late and even starting to drizzle, he had to postpone the raft plan. Finding a spot to sleep for the night mattered more. This limestone cave was not a bad choice. Inside, it was not only dry and cool, at night he wouldn't even need to make a fire to stay warm. Just like that, by day 2, the jungle returned to its usual quiet. Eddie hadn't eaten fried dough or steamed buns yet. He went to collect some dry firewood nearby and tore up the abundant vines to make rope. First, he tied a triangle frame, then laid branches on top to make the floor. In less than an hour, a finely crafted raft was completed. Eddie sat down full of hope. However, Eddie the Sink lived up to his name. Not only did he build fast, he sank just as fast. The moment he sat down, he was already halfway submerged. But none of that mattered. As long as it floated, it was fine. Just like that, Eddie drifted along the raft until the afternoon. By now, he hadn't eaten in 2 days. His body desperately needed food to restore energy. Seeing a fig tree on the riverbank with many red fruits hanging from it, Eddie docked his raft and used a bamboo stick to knock the fruits down. The figs were crystal clear and sweet and soft to eat. Their vitamin C content was dozens of times higher than beef. Eddie ate 2.5 pounds in one go. Seeing the rain start again, Eddie decided to stop here for the day. He went into the forest by the river to find shelter for the night. This hollow ancient tree looked just right in length, size, and shape. When the rain stopped, Eddie began preparing to make a fire. Using a stone knife, he split some bamboo to make a bundle of torches and started rubbing like crazy. After half an hour, the flames burst up. Next, he had to find a way to get some protein. The sound of insects buzzing proved there were definitely bugs nearby. Every 2 steps he took, he caught a cricket. No need to pull off heads or tails, straight into the mouth. Crispy with a chicken flavor, the protein content dozens of times higher than beef. Then he caught a fatty flower butterfly and still tossed the whole thing into his mouth, wings and all. On the way back to camp, he saw a centipede and threw it straight into the charcoal fire. Roasted to perfection, crispy outside and tender inside, crunchy in the mouth. Its protein content thousands of times higher than beef. By day 3 of the challenge, Eddie still hadn't found a proper path to cross the mountain. All around were towering cliffs. Climbing them really was harder than reaching the sky. He finally spotted a gap ahead. Climbing ashore, he almost fell into the river along with his chicken. After paddling all day, he decided to rest overnight by the shore. The next morning, to prepare for the grueling road ahead, Eddie split some bamboo to make water bottles, then packed up his gear and began the mountain crossing. Climbing this steep road, Eddie didn't dare let his guard down even for a step. Sure enough, as soon as he said that, Eddie slipped and fell straight down. Falling wouldn't have been a problem, except this time something really happened. Looking up, he spotted a wild landmine not far away. It looked even older than Eddie himself. It scared Eddie so much, his non-existent hair almost stood straight up. If he had stepped on it by mistake, no one here would have escaped collapsing together with just $200. Eddie didn't dare linger long and quickly left the danger zone. After hiking for over 3 hours, his fresh water was all gone. Finally, he saw light at the top of the mountain. He hurried up and the breathtaking view before him lifted his spirits. His destination was the valley far in the distance. After confirming where to go, Eddie moved non-stop toward the mountain base. Along the way, he still had to keep an eye out for fresh water. He didn't know how long he walked, but finally a small stream appeared before him. He lay down, soaking in the cool water. Naturally, he gave his head a rinse too. Drank more, even bathed to refresh himself. Nuts scattered nearby tasted just like almonds. Exploring further, he found a patch of big chicken kidney mushrooms. Eddie ate one bite after another without stopping. He also found an unknown wild fruit on the ground. It was soft and delicious beyond imagination. Honestly, it was like he was on a food tour. By the 5th day of the challenge, after waking up, Eddie walked along the stream. When the challenge reached the 7th day, he finally made it to the end of the stream. But ahead stood a cave. According to the fake map he saw earlier, to reach his goal, he had to go through this cave. Otherwise, taking a detour would make finishing in 10 days nearly impossible. Eddie first stood at the cave entrance to survey the area, then searched for a camphor tree. Its resin was an excellent material for torches. He first used a stone to knock off the outer bark. Then he started a fire in the cave. Once it burned down, he smothered it with leaves. By the next day, a large amount of resin would flow out. Early the next morning, he checked inside and indeed found a lot of resin. Eddie collected it into bamboo tubes, then mixed it with sawdust and wrapped it in palm leaves. One torch bundle was ready. To avoid unexpected danger before entering, Eddie made sure to report his plan to the rescue team. Then, without looking back, he crawled into the cave. As soon as he entered, darkness surrounded him. The torch became his only light source. Worse still, the deeper he went, the less oxygen there was. The torch couldn't hold on any longer and soon went out. At this point, everything was pitch black for Eddie. He could only rely on the faint light from the camera to grope his way forward. This made Eddie feel very uneasy. A single misstep could lead to unimaginable consequences. Luckily, before long, a beam of light appeared ahead. No doubt about it, that had to be the exit. Eddie was so happy he couldn't help but let out a weird gay laugh. As he stepped out of the cave, a building appeared before his eyes, marking the perfect end of this challenge. This was definitely the most miserable jungle episode Eddie ever had. 7 days in and he only caught a tiny fish weighing barely over 100 grams. He threw it on the fire, roasting it crispy outside, tender and cooked inside. One bite and the whole thing, bones and all, was gone. Besides that, he also found a dead alpaca. He ate crunchy lizard sashimi that tasted like chicken. The entire journey was purely carried by willpower. This time, Eddie came to the Atacama Desert in Bolivia. The elevation is high and the climate is hot and dry. The average annual rainfall is less than 5 millimeters. The barren plateau is even more desolate than Eddie's bald head. Before starting the challenge, he had an intimate interaction with the local alpacas. Then he rode with the film crew on a nuclear-powered helicopter. Quickly arriving at the challenge site, as usual, no food, no survival gear, not even any hair. All he brought was a brick phone and a camera. Eddie had to reach a reservoir 50 kilometers away in the next 10 days. No fake map, no compass. Eddie relied on the tilt of shadows. He quickly determined the snowy mountain in the distance was his direction. Then he strapped on his backpack and started walking. However, carrying dozens of kilos of gear at an altitude over 4,000 meters, Eddie was soon exhausted and out of breath. Moreover, he felt his throat going dry. If this kept up, he knew his body would soon be drained. So Eddie decided to descend into the canyon ahead. Not only could he avoid the harsh sunlight overhead, but he might even find fresh water at the bottom of the valley. Just like that, Eddie walked in the canyon for 2.5 hours until noon. Since the shadow was directly beneath him, Eddie could no longer rely on it to navigate. He could only depend on the fake map in his head while following the stream. He kept walking until afternoon when Eddie noticed the vegetation getting thicker. The ground underfoot was also becoming damper. Sure enough, along with Eddie's signature gay, a river over 10 meters wide appeared ahead. No time to hesitate. He lay down and eagerly gulped it down. It was sweet and refreshing. It quenched his thirst better than beef by far. Right after drinking, he saw dark clouds rolling in. Seconds later, thunder rumbled across the sky. This was not good news for Eddie. After all, a bald head is way more likely to attract lightning than one with hair. He quickly searched for shelter nearby. A rock cave up ahead looked promising. Eddie stayed silent and crawled right in. No time to make a fire. Tonight he would just sleep under the sky, using the earth as his mat. The next morning, Eddie didn't rush to leave. He went to the riverbank to see if there were any supplies he could use. Surprisingly, he actually found an old heirloom iron kettle. Then he picked up a dry branch perfect for making a bow drill. Eddie returned to camp and began preparing to start a fire. He took off his shoelaces and quickly crafted a simple hand drill. Then he began to rub it repeatedly. In theory, with the dry and hot climate here, starting a fire shouldn't be hard. But Eddie rubbed the drill for 2.5 hours. Little Eddie got so tired he cramped up. Still no spark. Eddie guessed it was because of the high altitude. The oxygen level was too low, but he didn't want to give up just like that. Eddie rested for a bit, then started rubbing again. This time, luck finally smiled upon the bald man. With a gentle breath, the fire god responded and a flame was born. Since he didn't catch any protein today, he could only rely on the campfire to get through the night. By the third day of the challenge, to carry this hard-earned fire starter, Eddie found a type of plant nearby called yareta. Once ignited, it could burn for a very long time. Eddie placed a piece into the iron kettle, then packed up and set off again. This time, Eddie planned to follow the river. Along the way, he noticed what looked like an animal carcass across the river. Eddie waded across and discovered a decomposing alpaca corpse. Definitely not edible, but still useful. Eddie put all his effort into breaking off the alpaca's hind leg. The tendons were perfect materials for making rope. After packing it up, Eddie continued on his way. They say that once luck finds you, nothing can stop you. He hadn't walked long when he found a plastic bottle, perfect to use as a water container. Unfortunately, it had a duck neck inside. The further he went, the more rugged the terrain became. Even a slight misstep could shatter bones. Carrying dozens of kilos of gear on his back made Eddie extremely miserable. Completely exhausted, he carefully walked to a safe zone. Eddie found a nearby cave and decided to rest there for the night before continuing. The fire starter in the iron kettle was still burning, so Eddie easily lit a fire. In a flash, it was already day 4. As the saying goes, real men shed tears too, just not lightly, but now Eddie's eyes were red. The reason? He'd gone 4 whole days without food and was feeling pitiful enough to cry. After calming down a bit, Eddie took out the Jinhua goat leg he'd picked up earlier. He extracted the tendons and soaked them in water to soften. Then, with his skilled hands, he braided them into rope. Combining it with the iron hook he'd previously found, a full fishing kit was ready. He used the goat leg meat as bait, then fixed the hook to the riverbank with a branch. Now all that was left was to wait, but sitting around wasn't Eddie's style. To boost his chances, Eddie decided to build a fish trap along the riverbank. He carried large stones from nearby to block off the exit, leaving only a funnel-shaped entrance. After finishing the trap, Eddie still didn't rest. Instead, he went into the nearby bushes to catch a small lizard, planning to have a little appetizer. After a while of hunting, he actually caught one. No need to pull off the head or tail, straight into the mouth. Crispy with a chicken flavor. It felt like chewing beef tendons. Then he went to check the fishing line. As expected, not even a single fish scale was on it. Just when Eddie was feeling disappointed, the stone trap delivered a big surprise. A lucky fresh fish had wandered in. Eddie stripped off his clothes and jumped into the river, caught it effortlessly. He was so happy he let out a weird gay laugh. Looking closer, it weighed over 100 grams. Finally, he could have a decent meal. He gutted the fish on the spot, returned to camp, and threw it straight onto the charcoal fire. 15 minutes later, the smell of grilled salmon filled the whole camp. As a British gentleman, even though he was starving, certain rituals were still necessary. Eddie placed the fish on a stone and began enjoying his first protein-rich meal in 4 days. As soon as it entered his mouth, tender, juicy, fresh, firm, delicious, to the point of explosion. Not to mention the protein content was thousands of times higher than beef. Eddie ate until not a single bone remained. He slept soundly until morning. On day 5, Eddie left the river and continued toward his destination. To clearly determine his direction, Eddie decided to climb the hill ahead. Using both hands and feet, he quickly made it to the top. From there, everything around was within view. After pinpointing the location of the snowy mountain, Eddie continued on. However, it wasn't long before a steep slope blocked his path. Taking a detour would cost time and energy. After thinking carefully, Eddie decided to take the risk and descend the slope. After landing safely, he saw a river ahead. Eddie planned to get closer and drink some water to refresh himself. But unexpectedly, as he got closer, he smelled seawater. He tasted a sip, and sure enough, it was salty seawater. Although this river wasn't drinkable, it indirectly told Eddie that the salt lake wasn't far anymore. On the 6th day of the challenge, seeing only 250 ml of water left in his bottle, Eddie still hadn't seen the destination. The hills kept rolling endlessly, making Eddie feel a bit uneasy. Eventually, even his water ran out. With no supplies left at all, Eddie had no idea how much longer he could hold on. He forced himself to walk another 3 hours with a parched throat. After climbing the final hill, finally he saw the salt lake at his destination. At this point, this challenge came to a perfect end. It's done. The fasting expert struck it rich this time, surviving in the rainforest and still getting unlimited protein. Not only did he get to eat sweet, cool cucumbers, but he also used a homemade spear gun to catch a fish, paired with powdery bananas to make spicy fish head hot pot, sipped on 1982 aged Assam milk tea and chewed spicy dried fish. A serious wilderness survival show, Eddie somehow turned it into a paid vacation. Wedged between Panama and Colombia, the Darien Gap stretches 160 kilometers with dense rainforest. It's not only filled with deadly plants and animals, but also the world's biggest smuggling paradise. Its danger level rivals that of Thailand's Golden Triangle. But this time, Eddie challenged it alone. Riding a nuclear-powered speedboat, Eddie quickly reached deep into the rainforest. No survival gear, not even any hair. Eddie had to reach a village 30 kilometers away in the next 10 days. As always, he first inspected his equipment. The sun's shadow currently pointed directly north. Eddie quickly deduced that he needed to head east, but he didn't rush off immediately. He planned to scavenge for useful supplies on the beach first. Before long, he found a rusty dagger, along with a few pieces of driftwood for fire starting. He also picked up some coconut fibers nearby to use as tinder. Only then did Eddie start walking. Right ahead was a river flowing east to west. Eddie followed it, saving time and energy. When thirsty, he just lay down and slurped it up. It tasted sweet and refreshing. The thirst-quenching index was dozens of times higher than beef. Then he continued heading east for over 3 more hours. By now, the sun was already slanting low. Eddie constantly kept an eye on the shadow's position to make sure he wasn't straying too far off track. And so he continued forward. The terrain around him grew more treacherous. Eddie started feeling worn out. He also felt very hot and stuffy. If he kept going, he might suffer from heat stroke. Since there wasn't much daylight left anyway, Eddie found a clear spot by the river. He decided to rest here for the night. The next morning, he first rinsed his face briefly by the stream, then continued his survival journey. The terrain was still rough, and the river grew more rapid. After walking for a while, a waterfall appeared ahead, estimated to be at least 7 or 8 meters high. Climbing it would be too risky. After thinking for a bit, Eddie chose to detour around the hill beside it. However, this created a new problem. Earlier, he could rely on the sound of the river to stay oriented, but the further he got from the river, Eddie gradually lost his sense of direction and couldn't hear the water anymore. Even worse, his throat was starting to feel dry again. Now he only had 2 choices in front of him. Either go back the way he came or take the risk and move forward. Of course, Eddie didn't want to turn back, so he kept going uphill. The water in his body was quickly running out. If he couldn't drink soon, there was a serious risk of heat stroke and collapse. Eddie pushed himself to climb to the top of the hill. The beautiful view before him lifted his spirits. But right now, Eddie didn't have time to enjoy it. After roughly planning his route, he continued non-stop toward the mountain base. Along the way, he had to stay alert for any fruit trees. He spotted some long fruits hanging above and picked one. He bit into it and chewed. It was crisp and tasted a bit like cucumber. It wasn't just full of water, it also provided Eddie with a decent energy boost. Eddie ate more than a dozen in one go, then continued down the mountain. After walking for 2 hours, he arrived at the area. He thought he would find a water source quickly, but instead saw a dried up riverbed. However, Eddie didn't give up. He walked along the riverbed in search of something. Maybe he'd find a few leftover pools of water. Along the way, he spotted some water vines. From past experience, they usually held fresh water inside. Eddie tried cutting a segment with his knife, but after several chops, they were all dry inside. No point in continuing with those. Eddie wasn't willing to give up and kept walking forward. Luckily, heaven didn't let him down. In a small corner, he discovered a clear little puddle. The water was crystal clear with a golden hue. It looked drinkable as is, but considering how deep in the wilderness he was, Eddie chose to be extra cautious. He dug a shallow hole beside it to pre-filter the water. While waiting for the sediment to settle, he looked nearby to see if he could find a container. This area was full of smugglers and flower merchants. Finding trash they left behind wouldn't be difficult. After searching for a while, he found several plastic bottles. Only one had a cap. Returning to the puddle, the filtering was nearly done. Eddie filled the bottle completely. Then it was time to drink to his heart's content. Its color almost like Assam milk tea. He took a sip. The aroma of earth mixed with decaying leaves. It tasted amazing, so good that Eddie was speechless. Seeing the day drawing to a close, Eddie decided to rest here overnight. The next morning, he continued trekking through the rainforest. The dense vegetation not only slowed him down, but trees could also be hiding cashews. Luckily, the sound of rushing water came just in time to lift Eddie's spirits. Following the sound, Eddie found a small stream. Without hesitation, he lay down to cool his body. Inside, he saw plenty of small aggressive fish. Eddie immediately got an idea and decided to teach them a lesson. On day 4, he took the plastic bottle he found days ago and cut it in half. He inverted one end into the other to make a simple fish trap. As bait, he used a few ants he had caught. While waiting for the trap to work, Eddie prepared to start a fire. He pulled out his trusty shoelace and quickly built a bow drill. Eddie Fire reactivated his old skills. The environment here was hot and humid. Eddie spent a full hour, meaning 2.5 hours, rubbing with the bow drill. Finally, a spark was born. He placed it in dry coconut fiber and the flame flared up immediately. Then he went to check the fish trap. To his surprise, there was a good catch inside. 5 or 6 small fish. Eddie threw them straight onto the charcoal fire. The outside charred, the inside soft. He took a bite. Crunchy, chicken-like, the protein content dozens of times higher than beef. Eddie kept eating piece after piece without stopping. Full and hydrated, Eddie began reviewing the day's work. By day 5, early in the morning, Eddie couldn't wait any longer to set off. To reach his destination as soon as possible, Eddie had to leave the river and go inland. But unsurprisingly, this led him straight into another water shortage. After hiking for more than 5 hours, the water in Eddie's bottle had run dry. Now, he once again faced the problem of dehydration. Luckily, after continuing forward for a while, he spotted a stream through the trees and quickly laid down to cool his forehead. Back on shore, he noticed signs of human activity nearby. Even more surprising, there was an abandoned rice cooker beside it. This made Eddie incredibly happy. Before, all his food had been grilled. Now with this pot, he finally had a chance to show off his cooking skills. His top priority, the medium-sized fish he had just caught. Eddie first crafted an arrowhead from palm leaves, then tied it to a wooden stick and used the elastic strap from his backpack as propulsion. A homemade fish gun was complete. Eddie then went into the water, transforming into Aquaman to begin his hunt. He timed his shots carefully and fired over a dozen times. He actually managed to catch several fish, both big and small. Gotta admit, Eddie really had some skills. Back on land, he also found a banana tree with a large bunch of bananas hanging. Eddie swung his fists the size of sandbags and elbowed like crazy, and successfully harvested a whole bunch of bananas. He then tossed the fish into the pot and sliced the bananas into thick pieces. Threw them into the pot to cook together for 15 minutes. A delicious and nutritious spicy banana fish head stew was ready. Proudly, he picked up a piece and stuffed it into his mouth. The flavor was perfectly seasoned. The protein content dozens of times higher than beef. Full and hydrated, he slept soundly until the next morning. Before leaving, Eddie drank to his fill, then once again plunged into the rainforest. By noon on the 7th day, Eddie noticed the sky shifting from sunny to overcast. This made it difficult to use the sun for navigation. He could only rely on instinct, moving toward the brightest direction. The further he walked, the more the surrounding vegetation changed. Low shrubs began to replace tall jungle trees. This meant he was about to exit the rainforest. Sure enough, after crossing a banana grove, a river appeared ahead. He took 2 sips of water to ease his worries. At that moment, a small boat was approaching not far away. After a short coded exchange, he confirmed it was the right contact. With that, this survival challenge also came to a perfect end.